So I've chosen today to talk about the concept of care, which is, of course, a capacious concept. And so I'm going to focus on care at work specifically, and that meaning work in both in two senses. One, how does care actually operate? And also the labor of care. And I've read this, actually, three senses: care in one's professional workspace. So first, I want to acknowledge some wonderful undergraduate students who have been working with me for a while on ostensibly looking at materials for this project, but also they just sit and talk with me through it, and they come from backgrounds including ethnic studies, public health, computer science, East Asian studies, history, and so on. So thank you to Dujian Chen, Belinda Hu, Brianna Ni, Xiaoshan Peck, Audrey Taylor, and Adam Yo. So as you might already have a hint, I'm going to get a bit personal here, but with a purpose. And so I want to give a sort of selective list of some of the kinds of care at work that I have experienced either directly or noticed in the past several years during this time of overlapping crises. Some of you may recognize your own work in this list. But it's meant to be sort of generalized. So this includes things like this: knitting hats, scarves, and blankets for people at the beginning or end of their lives. Making masks. Remember when we were making masks? Or sharing our personal mask supplies. Cooking and delivering meals. Cooking and serving meals. Dropping off unexpected garden flowers and fruit or a spontaneous card. Selecting and delivering memorial trees. Organizing funerals and memorials for colleagues who are also friends. Organizing safe transport and a safe destination for someone in an endangered situation. Hanging onto a Zoom or sitting in an office with a student 2, 3, 4 times longer than originally scheduled. Offering space, physical, mental, emotional, to students who have had disturbing encounters with police. Accompanying students to arraignments. Sitting, walking, talking, sharing a meal with, spending much time with, both calendrically and the time of attention, with someone who has had a disturbing experience at work. Sitting and spending time with a student or colleague's family. Connecting someone to your therapist or your, whether mental health or physical health. Visiting a colleague or a student in the hospital or hospice. Taking a colleague or a student to the doctor. Flying to see a colleague in their last days. Video calling a colleague in their last hours. Making so many calls, sending so many emails and text messages of support, advocacy, organizing, and just how are you? So this is a partial list. So the first thing I will repeat is that I believe and hope that all of us in this room will hear things they have done and think of more, and also think of ways that it resonates with life outside of work. The second thing, though, is what becomes obvious is that all of the actions in this list, almost all of them, lie outside of our job descriptions. Certainly, they lie outside of the metrics by which we are evaluated and rewarded in the workplace. And I think that regardless of what institution you are at now, you have to fill out some kind of instrument every year that evaluates your productivity. Even when service is counted, often these kinds of things lie outside it. By saying this, I don't mean to discount the care that many workers and academics in this instance apply to improving their workplaces and work conditions. That is in itself exhausting and frustrating labor. Still, even parts of that lie within the purview of what is generally accepted as professional work, in academia often categorized as either being a good colleague or someone who shows up. By making this sample list of other kinds of care, I want to call attention to all the work we do that is not work in the professional sense, but that is fundamental to our professional identities and how we grapple with this world. It includes emotional labor, but it is also an expenditure of mental and physical effort that exceeds even the category of emotional labor. In other words, it's the work of care and attention. And noting this too, this list addressed visible care in and around the workplace, and of course we repeat many of these same actions in our other circles of social existence. By mentioning the word attention, I may have inadvertently caused a sense of exhaustion to resonate among you. I feel that way when I think about attention, because in this world, the word attention also implies exhaustion and distraction. Our ability to care materially as well as mentally is under constant bombardment from the expansion of the attention economy. But this is no mere technological condition, even though technological change enables it. It's a function of living in an era of emergency. Emergency is, of course, fundamental to the state of exception and underpins the suspension of law and the creation of geographic and social zones of people who are designated non-human. And whereas a lot of the work on attention focuses on the relationship between the individual and technology or media, whether that's in the area of cognitive psychology or in terms of social formation. I think it's at times useful to marry these two strains of thought as a reminder that emergency, whether declared by a state or in the form of the overwhelm of information and responsibility that comes in times of crisis, is simultaneously an exception, a distraction, and a sort of self-generated, self-perpetuated state of being and seeing in reaction to the underlying social and political conditions. I think this is the one place where actually cognitive psychological work on trauma and PTSD helps us, because it puts this kind of reaction in the framework of the cycle of fight, flight, freeze, or the options of fight, flight, and freeze, which we're seeing on a more generalizable social level rather than just an individual psychological level. I think there's another underlying condition to this current emergent way of thinking, and Adi already alluded to it earlier this morning, which is the collapse of the humanitarian regime. The humanitarian regime, the international humanitarian regime, is collapsing for a whole host of reasons. Some of them are the reasons of nationalist populism and domestic politics. So we saw this during the Trump era, the attacks on the UN as institution, both from an economic point of view and then also from an ideological point of view of verging on conspiracy theory. But there are other reasons too. Partly that the humanitarian regime, of course, is underpinned by colonialism and the history of colonialism. And scholars have pointed this out in a number of different ways. In the area that I work in, which is modern Chinese history, Glenn Peterson has pointed out how the kind of semi-colonial condition of China in the late 19th century, where it was not completely colonized, but there were spheres of influence and treaty ports controlled by foreign powers, really made visible the inherent contradictions of the humanitarian regime when it came to things like political asylum, because you had different political conditions operating in the same country, but then also very selectively applied depending on the person's ethnic descent and other reasons as well. So, and then I guess I would add to this to say that, of course, there's a legacy of national and religious particularism in the history of what is considered like the modern history of global charities that then gets repurposed as humanist universalism underpinning the humanitarian regime, the international humanitarian regime. And in saying that, I don't want to imply that I'm reverting to this sort of very nationalist critique of human rights that started in the 1990s. You still see some evidence of today that each culture has its own rights, and therefore we need to sort of police our borders from these transnational ideas of humanitarianism. I would say instead the important thing is that the cracks that we see in the current system kind of betray its origins and actually also inspire this reactionary force of particularism, ever narrowing, especially nationalist particularisms that are disguised as universal values, and this is what we heard in our discussion of history this morning. But in thinking about this sort of bigger problem, and then also how it connects to things that I've been researching for a while, which have to do with wartime displacement and community formation in China and Taiwan in the mid-20th century, I found myself thinking, thinking about this question of the universalist claims of the humanitarian regime versus particularism, and asking whether all particularism is inherently damaging, or whether there are some forms that we might prize out of history and give another critical look at. In history, I think that there are some examples, of particularistic caring that are nonetheless deeply ethical, sometimes replicable, and I think precisely because many of them evoke this more capacious sense of cosmos and this world that Mohammed told us about this morning. So that's sort of the framework that I'm approaching care, and I'm going to give a few more generalized comments on how people have the frameworks in which people have looked at care, but also think about some examples of professional struggles with caring and showing care more specifically. And then I'll allude to a couple of historical examples at the end of the paper. So of course it's important to have on the table the copious scholarship that has come out of the history and sociology of medicine, public health, and so on, that has pointed out not only the feminization but the racialization of care. The fact that so many of our current medical systems around the world are dependent on, in some cases, the remnants of colonial relationships that established institutions of learning for medical expertise in colonized places, and then still serve as sources of medical care workers for the former metropole. And I'm thinking of medical workers and carers from the Caribbean in the UK, or from the Philippines in the United States, for example. But we see other versions of this happening around the world, especially in the area of elder care. We've had a lot of discussion since the pandemic years about, and still are living in this moment of burnout in the medical industry, and drawing on those gender and racial inequities. So I guess I want to think about what is happening in other sites of care as well. And I would say here that institutions, such as institutions of higher education, often make a nod to they try to reframe their engagement with biopolitics in a sort of positive, progressive way, usually in a heteropatriarchal framework. So trying to create more resources for childcare, more recognition of people's family situations. But I think that at the same time, institutions are also resting on a kind of necromanagement. It's not necessarily the very violent necromanagement of policing institutions or colonial institutions, but it is a necromanagement in terms of the overall culture of the institution, which is that is a part of life which should be kept contained, that we don't often talk about, whereas we can talk about our children and how we're, the problems they're having in school, or even sometimes, occasionally, our elderly parents. And I've thought about this a lot, partly for very individual reasons, but they continue to resonate in other places. In fall 2017, I was getting ready I was teaching a course that was really my favorite course to teach at that point. It was called The Social Lives of China, Social Lives of Dead Bodies in China and Beyond. And despite the grim title, it was one of my favorite classes to teach because the topic animated and connected students in a way that I found that no other course I taught did. We took care, we showed respect, we used good analytical frameworks. It was born out of work I had done with colleagues in various disciplines in the China field, but the syllabus grew to be more comparative and connective over time. But that fall, I came to campus within 2 weeks of watching my sister die unexpectedly after a summer assisting her through a painful and at the time unexplained illness. And that's not so much not as important as what happens afterwards. My colleagues warmly helped me to get me through the immediate transition. Some gave deep care for months to come. Will come as no shock to the room that the majority of those who did so were women of color. But I kept on teaching the class, and I blame myself actually for partly for never saying, like, maybe I shouldn't be teaching this right now. But no one ever asked, should you be teaching this now? Is this good for the students or yourself? I was in the second year as director of graduate studies, so I was deep in that problem-solving mode that happens after a crisis. And so part of solving the problem is deciding that I could not abandon the students. But when I reflect back on that period, I'm not happy with the work I did. I think I dropped some balls, and I feel that that the culture of the profession and the culture of work in which I have been ingrained, me personally, as well as the institution, led me to think that to reveal too much about any kind of struggles was unseemly, excessive. Yet we permit excessiveness at work in other ways. Personalities that are domineering, self-regard, people who love to hear their own voice don't have an edit button. In fact, that's often considered to be a plus in professional advancement. But the unseemliness of these kind of revelations of struggle and of very uncomfortable topics is much more difficult. 2017, however, seems like a sort of paradise compared to what has happened afterwards. And so the unevenness of provisions for medical insurance, leave, and privacy across work institutions is a long-standing concern that only became more intense during COVID. The pandemic brought also into relief systemic inequities with around childcare, and sometimes around older family members. Not as often around other people that we support and care for, friends and found family. So in some ways I feel that this kind of heteropatriarchal nature of work institutions, including the university, is out of step with the kinds of creative and diverse social formations that we teach about every day, and that our students are kind of leading the way in pursuing. Thank you. I can stop now. She was just giving me a time check. I got 5 more minutes. So that's a good reminder, though, that I should skip ahead from this. And so I just want to note that we're surrounded by trauma and mourning, and it's not just of our students. We tend to address it in a very, also a problem-solving mode. Counselors are brought forth, statements are sometimes made, but people also need space, they need time off, they need much longer standing solutions and the way we know this is burnout. Burnout is real in most professions now, and it's actually shaping the ability to receive care because of the lack of staffing. So just to conclude with some history. So in my own field of Chinese history, scholars have written a lot about how a staple of good government during prior to the 20th century was a complex system mandating that scholar officials take mourning leave after the death of a relative, sometimes for inconveniently long periods. During the 20th century, the moral and social hierarchies that underpinned that system started to fall apart, along with the government that supported it. But it was hard to shake this kind of fundamental idea that governments and institutions that assisted people in burying and mourning the dead were good governments and institutions. And so there are several instances of this coming to, appearing in the archives even, and even more so in oral histories and other kinds of documents, that as the governments sort of shed their responsibilities to take care of the war dead, whether civilian or military, and part of that through logistical difficulties, but part of it also from rejecting this idea of government righting the cosmological wrongs that led to these deaths away from home. We see a number of different institutions, social institutions, step up in the breach. So we see, for example, charities, native place associations, delegating the burial, temporary storage, transport of the dead. Civilian co-workers looked after their friends' bodies, as did military buddies. Buddhist and Salvationist religious groups and lineage organizations managed the well-being of the dead, particularly those who died away from home. And throughout, I would argue that it's not just about the physical problem of burial or even the logistical problem, the family-centered problem of bringing people back to their home place to be buried, but this is also about looking after the well-being of the dead in terms of rituals for hungry ghosts, prayers for universal well-being and the pacification of all war dead, and so on. So one interesting thing that I discovered in the course of research, for example, was, I guess, 2 things that come out of the wartime capital in Chongqing. So one is several sets of co-workers requesting care for the death of someone who had migrated to their area, oftentimes young women alone, and then their co-workers trying to find some sort of proper end for them. But there was also a case of a local, very, very local government official in the immediate post-war after Chongqing sending all kinds of communications back east because he said there's someone who has come here from your hometown and died during the war, and we have him buried in the locality, and this is a problem for us. So how is it a problem? It's a moral problem, a logistical problem. It's also probably, unstated, a problem of haunting. Ho Nhat Quan, in his wonderful work on the American War in Vietnam, talks about death in the street versus death at home, and how this creates a reciprocal responsibility for the stranger in each place. both ritual and sort of moral. So I want to mention these cases, not to sort of make a direct analogy of necessarily of something that we can apply in our own lives, but to just say that the care of the living and the dead are intimately intertwined. We sometimes focus on one more than the other, but that we would be well served by thinking maybe in these kind of cyclical terms that we just heard as a way of repairing society. Thank you.